June 15, 1944. The Philippine Sea. Off the coast of Saipan, Vice Admiral Nagumo stood in his command post on Saipan and watched the American fleet assembling offshore and understood for the first time in his career that there was nothing he could do. Nagumo had commanded the carrier strike force that attacked Pearl Harbor. He had commanded the carriers at Midway, where he had lost 4 fleet carriers in a single morning. He had been sent to Saipan in a diminished role, commanding the Central Pacific Area Fleet from a shore headquarters on an island that he understood was about to be assaulted by a force he could not match. The fleet assembling offshore was the largest amphibious force the Pacific War had yet produced. 800 ships. More than 127,000 American soldiers and Marines waiting to come ashore. The naval gunfire that would precede the landing would be the heaviest in the Pacific theater, delivered by battleships and cruisers against an island whose defenders had been reinforced and fortified specifically because the Japanese High Command understood what the loss of Saipan would mean. It would mean that B-29 Super Fortress bombers flying from airfields on Saipan could reach Tokyo. It would mean that the defensive perimeter Japan had been counting on to keep the war far from the home islands had been penetrated at a point from which the home islands themselves were vulnerable. It would mean, and the Japanese High Command understood this with terrible clarity, that the war Japan had started in December 1941 was lost. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo had staked his government on Saipan's defense. His own words had made the promise explicit. Saipan was the absolute defense line. Lose Saipan, lose the war. The political logic was clear and the military logic confirmed it, and the 30,000 Japanese soldiers on the island under Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Sato had been given the mission of making that logic irrelevant by holding the island regardless of what it cost. What it cost was everything. The American assault that began on June 15, 1944 was the first major amphibious operation in which American forces encountered a Japanese civilian population of significant size. Saipan had approximately 30,000 Japanese and Korean civilians, many of them settlers who had come to the island in the decades when it was a Japanese mandate territory, who had been told by their government that American soldiers would torture and kill them if they were captured. The specific tragedy that this propaganda would produce was not visible on the morning of June 15, when the first Marines and soldiers waded ashore against defenders who contested the beach with the intensity of men who understood that there was no retreat available on an island 15 miles long. The landing was the costliest first day of any Pacific amphibious operation since Tarawa. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions lost approximately 2,000 men in the first 24 hours, taking beaches defended by artillery and mortars and machine guns that the naval bombardment had not suppressed as effectively as the planning had assumed. The terrain of Saipan complicated every aspect of the assault. The island's interior was dominated by Mount Tapachor, a peak that rose 1,554 feet above the surrounding terrain and that provided the Japanese defenders with observation over the entire American landing zone. The sugarcane fields that covered much of the island's southern portion provided concealment for Japanese defensive positions that were invisible until they fired. The towns of Garrison on the west coast and Charan-Kanoa in the center had been fortified in the way that island towns are fortified when the defenders have had months to prepare, with every building a potential strongpoint and every street a potential ambush. The Marines who fought through Saipan in June and July 1944 did so in a manner that was by then characteristic of the Pacific War's amphibious campaigns, with a combined arms proficiency that each successive operation had refined, with the tactical lessons learned from Guadalcanal and Tarawa and Bougainville and a dozen smaller engagements applied to new terrain against an enemy that never stopped trying to find the weakness in the American approach. The Battle of the Philippine Sea that interrupted the Saipan campaign on June 19th and 20th was the naval dimension of the strategic stakes. The Japanese mobile fleet that sortied from its bases to contest the Saipan landing and destroy the American carrier forces was the same force that had been stripped of its experienced aircrew at Rabaul. When it met the American carrier forces in the Philippine Sea, the result was the one-sided disaster that American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the destruction of approximately 480 Japanese aircraft in 2 days of combat that permanently ended Japan's ability to contest American carrier operations. The Marines and soldiers on Saipan heard the sound of the naval battle from their positions and understood in a general way that something significant was happening at sea. What they could not know was that the destruction of Japanese carrier air power in those 2 days had made their eventual victory on Saipan inevitable, because it meant that no Japanese reinforcement could reach the island and that the 30,000 defenders were on their own until the last one of them was dead. The Japanese defenders of Saipan understood this too. Lieutenant General Sato, receiving reports of the Philippine Sea disaster, sent a message to his commanders that contained the specific Japanese military formulation for hopeless resistance, the order to sell their lives dearly. They did. The banzai charge that Saito ordered on the night of July 6 to 7, 1944 was the largest in the history of the Pacific War and one of the most extraordinary military events of the entire conflict. Approximately 4,000 Japanese soldiers, the remnants of Saito's command, attacked along a 2-mile front in the pre-dawn darkness, pushing through the American lines with a momentum that overwhelmed the forward units and threatened to split the American position. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment bore the initial impact of the attack and were cut through and surrounded before they could establish a coordinated defense. The men who survived the first minutes of the assault fought as individuals and in small groups, using whatever weapons were available, in a situation that offered no tactical coherence and required only the most fundamental quality available to a soldier in extremis. They did not run. The battalion aid station where the wounded were being treated was overrun in the first minutes of the attack. The medical personnel who were in the station when the Japanese soldiers arrived continued treating patients while the fighting raged around them. The wounded soldiers who were well enough to fire their weapons did so from their litter positions. Artillery Officer Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien stood in the midst of the advancing Japanese soldiers and directed fire from his artillery batteries while fighting with a pistol in each hand until he was killed. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously. Around him, soldiers who had been in administrative positions, cooks and clerks and supply personnel, found weapons and joined the defensive effort because the alternative was being killed without fighting back. The banzai charge was finally stopped by the combined effect of artillery, direct fire from tanks, and the accumulated resistance of the men who held their positions in the darkness. By dawn on July 7th, approximately 4,300 Japanese soldiers were dead on the ground in front of and within the American positions. The battle that they had intended as a final demonstration of Japanese military spirit had resulted in the destruction of the last organized Japanese resistance on Saipan. Saito himself had committed ritual suicide before the banzai charge, dictating a final message to his troops that combined apology for his failure with encouragement for the charge that was about to happen. Nagumo, who had commanded at Pearl Harbor and Midway, also committed suicide on July 6th. What happened in the following days on the northern tip of Saipan was the specific tragedy that the Japanese propaganda about American soldiers had made inevitable. Japanese civilians who had retreated northward as the American advance pushed through the island's interior had gathered on the cliffs at the island's northern tip, at places that American soldiers would call Banzai Cliff and Suicide Cliff. They had been told that the Americans would torture and kill them. They had seen their soldiers die and had concluded from what they had been told that their own deaths were preferable to capture. They jumped. American soldiers who reached the clifftops found Japanese civilians jumping into the sea below, mothers holding infants, elderly couples supporting each other as they walked to the edge. American loudspeakers broadcast appeals in Japanese, assuring the civilians that they would be treated humanely, that there would be no torture, that surrender was safe. The appeals were not believed, because 3 years of Japanese government propaganda had been more effective than the truth that American soldiers were trying to communicate. Approximately 1,000 Japanese civilians died at the cliffs of Saipan. The precise number has never been determined. The photographs taken by American soldiers who arrived at the clifftops are among the most haunting images of the Pacific War, images that capture the specific tragedy of what propaganda does when it succeeds too well, when it produces a fear so complete that its victims preferred death to the possibility of discovering that the fear was unfounded. American soldiers tried to save the civilians. Some succeeded. Japanese Americans who served as interpreters waded into the water to pull civilians out. Military police who arrived at the cliffs physically restrained some civilians from jumping. The effort was real and it was insufficient, because the propaganda that had produced the fear was more powerful than the strangers who were trying to overcome it. Saipan was declared secured on July 9, 1944. The campaign had lasted 25 days and cost the American forces 3,126 killed and 13,160 wounded. Of Sato's 30,000 defenders, approximately 29,000 were dead. Only about 1,000 had been captured, most of them wounded. The political consequences in Japan were immediate and dramatic. Prime Minister Tojo resigned on July 18th, 9 days after Saipan was declared secured. His resignation was an acknowledgement that the absolute defense line he had staked his government on had fallen, that the strategic promise he had made to the Japanese people could not be kept. His successors understood what the fall of Saipan meant in ways that they could not say publicly without precipitating the collapse of the war effort they were still trying to sustain. The B-29s that would eventually take off from Saipan's airfields to bomb Tokyo were still being built in American factories. But the strategic logic of the situation was clear to anyone who understood it. Japan had lost the war when it lost Saipan. What remained was the question of how and when and at what additional cost the fact of the loss would be officially acknowledged. Admiral Nagumo, in his final hours before his suicide, reportedly said something to a staff officer that captured the specific melancholy of a man who had participated in both the attack that started the war and the defeat that made its outcome inevitable. He said that the Americans had proven themselves. He was right. The Marines and soldiers who had landed on Saipan on June 15th and had fought for 25 days through sugarcane fields and mountain terrain and towns and finally through the largest banzai charge in the war's history had proven something that was now obvious to every senior officer in the Japanese military who was willing to look honestly at the evidence. American soldiers would not stop. You could kill them in the wheat fields and in the woods and on the beaches and in the ravines, and more of them would come, and they would keep coming, and they would bring more ships and more guns and more supplies than anything the defensive doctrine of the Japanese military had accounted for. They were on Saipan. They had built the airfields. The B-29s were coming. Nagumo had been right at Pearl Harbor that the attack would produce 6 months of victories. He had been right that beyond 6 months, what would happen could not be promised. What happened was Saipan. What happened after Saipan was the end of everything that the attack on Pearl Harbor had been intended to prevent. The Americans had proven themselves. On Saipan, they had proven it for the last time that anyone in Japan had any doubt about it.